Hey, what's up? This is Phoenix and welcome back to my channel. I encourage you to hit that like button, to subscribe, and to invite your friends to come join us. I'm definitely putting a lot of work into my YouTube channel to make it the best that it can be. And so if you subscribe, you will continually be updated on what I've been working on. And that will be really beneficial for engaging with my channel. Now today I'm going to talk about Heraclitus as part of my Philosopher series. If you're wondering where you can find my other videos in my Philosopher series, check out the playlist and you can find some of the earlier episodes that I've made in this series. Now today I'm going to talk about Heraclitus. Heraclitus is another pre-Socratic philosopher, just like Parmenides. And Heraclitus was in direct opposition to Parmenides, at least philosophically and intellectually, and this is definitely something very interesting to consider. The quote that I opened up with is one often attributed to Heraclitus, and it is the idea that no man steps in the same river twice. And so while Parmenides had a philosophy fundamentally of indivisibility, as well as sameness and a lack of differences or a lack of change, Heraclitus was exactly the opposite and assumed that even the same river would be different, that you would be different for stepping in that river. And it's an interesting way of looking at change and how change is a part of our existence. As I said, Heraclitus was in direct opposition to Parmenides because, again, Parmenides was more about things that stay the same, while Heraclitus, maybe a little bit paradoxical in his approach, was much more interested in the things that are not the same, in the way that change categorizes our entire existence. Now, there's a lot of interesting things that could be said about Heraclitus. I would assume that he has been easily one of the most influential pre-Socratic philosophers, if not the most influential pre-Socratic philosopher. And the reason for that is because his ideas influenced Friedrich Nietzsche, of which was thinking about pre-Socratic philosophy and specifically Heraclitus and Heraclitus's notion of change. And Heraclitus is even considered by some standards a process philosophy of which focuses on the way in which things change in our existence. So while with someone like Plato later on you might get the notion of an essence of something that stays the same, or Parmenides' universe, you also get the process philosophers who focus on change, and this includes philosophers such as Whitehead, as well as many other philosophers, including Heraclitus. Now, Heraclitus is an interesting philosopher because he wrote his book, Fragments, and it's interesting to think about the form of fragments, because fragments is literally fragmented, as you can imagine, which might sound a little bit repetitive to say and redundant, but that is true. We lost a lot of his work, and so you have a lot of philosophers reconstructing his work and with whatever is left, and that's how we know of his philosophy. I have read Fragments, and I really enjoyed that book. They're very, very short aphoristic statements. Often each part is only a few words, and it's usually a very witty statement or aphoristic statement that possesses a single idea and that is very concise. And even though it might be a little bit different to suggest, a little bit unorthodox, I would say that Heraclitus was in some senses a poet. Actually, Heraclitus and the Fragments is very similar to another Greek poet, which was Sappho, and Sappho's poems were very fragmented as well. And so, what do we get with this notion of fragmentations in philosophy, of fragmented philosophical statements? Well, for one thing, you think of Nietzsche, and Nietzsche was very much into the impulse of writing creative works, and he often did that by capturing an aphoristic style of very brief statements, mostly brief statements, that he would expand upon in his philosophy. And so it's no surprise that there is a link between Nietzsche and Heraclitus in terms of their style. There will be, of course, much more on Nietzsche, but the basic idea, there will be much more on Nietzsche in later videos, but the basic idea for now is that the aphoristic style of the Fragments has been very influential to philosophers. And that's a pretty powerful idea as well. Now, Heraclitus was often very much engaged with notions of paradox. So in formal logic or formal philosophy, as you could call it, formal reasoning, we have the notion of the law of non-contradiction, which states that there are components to arguments that cannot be contradictory, that things must serve a logical function, statements must serve a logical function and cannot contradict themselves. Often this is attributed to Aristotle. But if you read Heraclitus, you will see that his philosophy is very much paradoxical. He contradicts himself, he comes up with a lot of different statements, and he expresses things in a contradictory way. And my interpretation of this is that he is trying to capture a vein or an impulse in human thought, which is that often human thought does not make sense. It can be paradoxical, it can be contradictory, it is not always logical, and that seems to be what Heraclitus was trying to capture with it and with his notions. And that's definitely a useful way of looking at it, because there's a lot that can be attributed to contradictory thought. Contradictory thought, I actually think, is very common, and I think that it is really a fundamental feature of human thought. And so while sure, we can focus on making our thoughts more logical and in line with a more logical perspective of the world, the so-called logos, there is a way in which there are also thoughts and events that happen in the world that are contradictory and that don't often make sense. And so I think that's very important to keep in mind as well. I personally am moved by the notion of paradox. Of course, I like Parmenides' idea that things are whole and things are the same, but there's also a kind of tantalizing and exciting idea, exciting associations with the notion that our thoughts are contradictory and paradoxical, which means that they don't have to fit any kind of ideology. They don't have to fit a narrow way of thinking. They can be whatever they're going to be. And that's why I link Heraclitus as being poetic with the poetic tradition, because I think that he's not just saying in a treatise or a logical explanation what things are. He's really trying to be very creative with his notions, and even a little bit experimental, and capturing the vein and impulse that we have of ideas and ideologies that aren't just one thing. And so I find an immense feeling of freedom from that idea. So Heraclitus was definitely about change. Nothing stays the same. Nothing is ever the same as we would imagine. And this is something that influences me a lot in my day-to-day life, because I think about how change is unexpected, but also a fundamental part of existence. Now, change, as a side note, is a very difficult thing to comprehend. While Heraclitus is focusing more on abstract notions and abstract ideas, there is a way in which change can be a very difficult thing. But it's also fundamental to our existence. And as my side note, I would say that change can be very hard to deal with. Change is not always easy to accept. And it happens so constantly, things are constantly different, and it can be kind of scary sometimes. And so that's why I see Heraclitus as kind of lighting a torch to these darker truths and helping us see, helping us be illuminated. And I think that that's very powerful. I think there's a lot that we can get out of it, of thinking of not the world as being fixed in one thing, but as being creative, essentially, as constantly making itself, as constantly changing. And I think that that is really cool. So I was going to say as well that for Heraclitus, fire is definitely a very strong metaphor that he uses. He sees fire as an element of existence, as probably the element of existence. And again, you could use flame and fire as a metaphor for change. When things are burned, they are often transformed. So it's easy for us to see change or something being burned as being bad, as being something negative, but it can also represent a positive change. It can represent transformation. Dare I evoke the idea of the phoenix. And so I'm very moved by these ideas as well, as you can imagine, and I see a lot that is valuable about these ideas. I'm going to say that overall Heraclitus has been an interesting philosopher in my thought and in the way that I write, because I'm often thinking about the way in which I can transform my writing in the way that I can essentially undergo a kind of radical transformation or a radical change. And I would say that that comes from Heraclitus. So yeah. So I hope that you enjoyed this talk. There is a lot more that could be spoken about Heraclitus, so I encourage you to check out his book, his Fragments, which you can find as a Penguin edition, for instance, but you can also find in various editions online, available online. And so I encourage you to look it up. So yeah, this is Phoenix, and Thank you for watching this episode in my series on philosophy and on philosophers, and there will be a lot more to come, and I hope that you enjoyed this talk. There will definitely be a lot more to come, so keep a lookout, and let's make this year 2020 the absolute best that it can be. This is Phoenix, and see you next time. Thank you for watching.